Some women don't reveal themselves. They move through the world like moonlight, soft, deliberate, and untouched by the noise that surrounds them. Their presence carries something ancient, something that whispers of both danger and serenity. And when a man meets such a woman, he doesn't understand what draws him in, only that he cannot look away. He believes it is her mystery that captivates him. But what he's really seeing is the reflection of his own forgotten depth. His longing is not for her, but for the parts of himself he lost in the pursuit of power, validation, and noise. She becomes the mirror, and the mirror does not lie. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." For many men, that fate wears the face of a woman who seems impossible to understand. She awakens something wild in him, something both sacred and terrifying. And yet he doesn't realize he isn't falling in love with her. He's falling in love with his own shadow, dressed in her silence. He will study her. He will search her eyes for answers. He will project onto her the shape of his longing, his fear, his hunger for something he doesn't yet know how to name. She becomes the screen onto which his inner chaos is painted. And she, if she is aware, will feel the weight of it, like fog gathering around her heart. Because the mysterious woman, the one he cannot forget, often carries a stillness that triggers his unrest. She doesn't perform for his attention. She doesn't rush to soothe his insecurities. Her value doesn't come from being chosen. It comes from her awareness of choice itself. And that awareness unsettles the unintegrated man. He is not used to a woman who does not orbit his ego. He confuses her serenity with emotional distance. But her silence is not a wall, it is a depth. A silence born from having met her own darkness and surviving it. He first noticed her in a crowded space. Not because she was loud, but because everything around her seemed to quiet down. There was something about the way she occupied the moment, fully, but without demand. Her movements were measured, her attention deliberate. It was as though time had conspired to move slower in her presence. He called it mystery. But mystery was simply the name he gave to what he could not control. Men like him, those who chase recognition, dominance, certainty, are rarely prepared for women like her. For they operate not on the currency of approval, but of energy. She doesn't need to be liked. She only needs to be. Her awareness of herself disarms the masculine ego, which thrives on conquest. He will feel the tension, the quiet ache of wanting to possess something that refuses possession. And yet, he will not understand that the ache itself is his teacher. It is the voice of his anima, the feminine aspect of his psyche, calling from within, asking to be seen, not in her, but in himself. This is the first illusion of attraction. He mistakes the awakening of his inner feminine for external desire. He believes she is the source of his passion, but she is only the catalyst. What he truly longs for is union with the part of himself he has rejected, the emotional, the intuitive, the tender, the unguarded. She will sense it, because the feminine, especially one attuned to her own depths, always feels the projection before it is spoken. His gaze carries weight, not admiration. It carries expectation. He doesn't just want her affection, he wants her to complete the story he cannot finish within himself. He wants her to carry his loneliness, to make his darkness beautiful. But she will not. Not this time. Because this woman, this archetype of the awakened feminine, knows the cost of carrying what isn't hers. She has already danced with her own shadow, the people-pleasing, the need to fix, the ache to be understood, and she has burned those skins in the fire of her awareness. She has learned that a woman becomes free when she no longer allows herself to be the mirror for someone else's unclaimed soul. And so, she moves differently. Her words are few, her energy measured. When he texts, she does not rush to reply. When he withdraws, she does not chase. When he tries to provoke her emotion, she remains composed, not out of strategy, but out of evolution. Because her peace is not a performance. It is her protection. He begins to feel it, the unease. The same energy that once pulled him close now makes him restless. He cannot name it, but he feels like he is losing something sacred. In truth, he is not losing her. He is losing access to his own reflection in her. Without her energy, His own emptiness echoes louder. This is the paradox of projection. What we fall in love with outside ourselves is often what we have abandoned within. He fell for her mystery because it resembled the forgotten beauty of his own soul. He fell for her stillness because it contrasted the chaos inside him. He fell for her silence because his spirit longed to rest in something that did not demand, only was. But now, as her detachment grows, he begins to confront what he projected outward. The longing turns inward. The ache becomes an invitation to meet the parts of himself he has avoided. And this, unknowingly, is her greatest gift to him. For the woman he cannot understand becomes the mirror that cracks open his unconscious. Through her absence, he begins to hear his own soul whisper. Through her distance, he begins to see how much of his desire was never about love, but about filling the void of self-estrangement. Yet she is not his healer. She is the threshold, the moment where his illusions meet their end. Her mystery was never a mask, it was a map, a symbol guiding him back to himself. And she? She continues walking, not away, but forward. Her energy no longer entangled with the projections of the unawakened. For she has learned that her light is not meant to illuminate the shadows of those unwilling to see their own. It is meant to reveal her path, clear and steady, toward her own individuation, her wholeness, her peace. Some call her cold. Others call her divine. But those who understand know she is neither. She is awake. He began to dream of her. Not in the way one dreams of romance or longing, but in fragments, a hand slipping through light, a voice that whispered without words, eyes that did not plead, only observed. She would stand in the distance, half illuminated, half unknown, and every time he tried to reach her, the ground would shift. He would wake with the taste of loss, yet he could not name what he was missing. It was never her, not really. It was himself, the self he had abandoned for the illusion of control, status, and certainty. Her mystery was the echo of his forgotten softness, calling him home. In Jungian language, this was the awakening of his anima, the feminine soul within the masculine psyche. Every man carries it, though few ever meet her consciously. She is not a woman made of flesh, but of emotion, intuition, and depth. When she is ignored, she hides beneath ambition, beneath the armor of logic and conquest. But when she stirs, often through the presence of a real woman, the man feels it as obsession, fascination, and confusion. He does not yet realize that what he craves is not possession, but integration. And she, the woman of mystery, was the mirror through which his anima first spoke. When a woman embodies her inner wholeness, she becomes dangerous to a man still at war with his unconscious. Not because she harms him, but because she disarms him. Her silence confronts the parts of him that seek validation. Her groundedness exposes his restlessness. Her authenticity reveals the performance he's grown used to living behind. He will call her different. He will say she feels familiar, as though he's known her forever. And he has, not in this life, but in the corridors of his psyche. She is the living image of the feminine within him that he has ignored. She triggers what he denies, and awakens what he represses. But his ego, the fragile guardian of identity, resists. It cannot accept that love might not be about merging with another, but about awakening to oneself. So it will twist the experience. It will turn fascination into fantasy, yearning into addiction. He will chase her body, her attention, her approval, believing that to have her is to complete himself. But the more he grasps, the further she drifts. Because what he seeks can never be captured, only integrated. She senses this. His need feels heavy, unspoken but alive. She feels him trying to pull something from her, a spark, a sense of meaning, a reflection to fill the emptiness he refuses to face. It is not malicious, it is unconscious. But she has learned what such energy costs. She once gave too much of herself to those who mistook her empathy for endless supply. She once believed love meant healing others while forgetting her own fractures. Now she knows better. She recognizes projection when she feels it pressing against her skin. She sees how his compliments are laced with control, how his tenderness hides dependency. She can taste the difference between connection and consumption. So she retreats, not in cruelty, but in clarity. Because to remain in that energy would be to betray the woman she has become. When she pulls away, he feels it like withdrawal. The same silence that once mesmerized him now becomes unbearable. He mistakes her distance for rejection, but it is actually a mirror, reflecting his own lack of self-connection. The very mystery that drew him now becomes the emptiness he must face alone. He begins to oscillate between yearning and resentment. He tells himself she was manipulative, too complex, too cold. But deep inside, beneath the noise of ego and pride, something begins to stir. A quiet, haunting realization. He never truly saw her, he saw himself through her. Her calmness mirrored the peace he longed for. Her mystery mirrored the depth he buried. Her self-possession mirrored the autonomy he had not yet developed. And when she left, she took with her the illusion that love could substitute self-awareness. This is the first death in any man's inner evolution, the death of projection. It is the moment he realizes that no woman can save him from his own unintegrated shadow. And in that realization, something sacred begins to form. He starts to remember moments, words she spoke that he dismissed, silences that unsettled him. He begins to replay her stillness, not as indifference, but as presence. There was something in the way she listened, not to him, but through him, as if she heard the voice he didn't yet know how to speak. And now, in her absence, that voice begins to emerge. He feels it first as discomfort, anxiety, guilt, confusion. But beneath that, there is an awakening, faint, fragile, but real. He starts to question himself. Why did he need her validation? Why did her boundaries feel like rejection? Why did her silence make him angry? Each question becomes a doorway into his unconscious, and the man who walks through those doors begins to see the architecture of his own shadow. He finds the wounded boy beneath the armor, the one who was never allowed to feel, who was taught that emotion was weakness. He sees how every relationship became a search for the mother he never truly met in tenderness. He sees how his desire for control was only a disguise for fear of abandonment. And now, in the absence of the woman he thought he loved, he begins to meet the woman within himself, the Anima, patient and eternal, waiting to be acknowledged. Meanwhile, she too is shifting. For a woman does not remain untouched by such encounters. Even if she is conscious, even if she knows projection when it comes, energy exchanges always leave echoes. She feels the pull of his longing, the tremor of his shadow trying to find form in her light. She walks through it slowly, purifying the residue through solitude, through silence. This is the sacred work of the awakened feminine, not to absorb, but to transmute. In her aloneness, she rediscovers softness, not the softness that pleases, but the softness that receives. She learns that empathy without discernment becomes self-erasure. She learns that mystery is not a weapon but a sanctuary, a space only those who have met their own darkness can enter without trembling. Her calm deepens. She does not speak against him. She does not explain, because explanation belongs to those still trying to be understood. She no longer needs that. The woman who has met her own shadow does not demand validation, she radiates coherence. And coherence, to those still fragmented, feels like magic. He sees her again, months later, perhaps by chance, perhaps by fate. The air shifts. She looks the same, yet something about her feels unreachable. Her presence is lighter, untethered. He smiles, but it feels small, as though the language they once shared has dissolved. He searches her eyes for the reflection he once saw, but it's gone. Because she no longer mirrors him, she mirrors herself. Her energy is sealed. What once absorbed now reflects. What once sought connection now radiates wholeness. And he feels it immediately, the gravitational pull, the familiar ache. But this time, it does not bind her. She nods, graceful and serene. He wants to say something, to apologize, to ask if she ever thought of him. But her silence answers everything. It is not cruel, but final, the silence of a woman who has integrated what she once carried for others. Her energy no longer feeds his projection. It calls him to his own awakening. He will remember her for years, not as a lost lover, but as a sacred disturbance. Because through her he glimpsed his own soul. And through losing her he learned what it means to find himself. There comes a moment in every awakening when silence stops being emptiness and becomes initiation. For him, that moment arrived one restless night when sleep refused him. He sat in the dark, phone in hand, her name still etched into his memory like a ritual he could not break. But the longing had changed its shape. It no longer screamed for her return, it whispered for his own. The descent had begun. He started to see that his desire was not love. It was hunger. A hunger for reflection, for warmth, for the parts of himself he had abandoned in the name of strength. All his life, he had built walls, degrees, achievements, charm, control. But beneath every accomplishment, there was a tremor, the sound of a soul that had never been held. When she entered his life, she became the mirror that cracked that illusion. Her mystery, her silence, her refusal to need, it exposed the parts of him he'd kept hidden under his masculine pride. She didn't wound him. She revealed him. And now, in her absence, he began to see what he had been avoiding all along. Himself. The shadow does not come gently. It does not arrive as poetry or insight. It comes as chaos, sleepless nights, endless questions, memories that sting like salt. He remembered how he'd once mocked emotions, how he'd hidden behind intellect, how he demanded loyalty without ever offering presence. He saw how he had used charm to disguise fear. And slowly, every illusion he'd built began to burn. This was not punishment, it was purification. The ego death Jung wrote about. The fall from the tower of self-image into the valley of truth. And yet, somewhere in that descent, he began to breathe again. Because beneath all the noise, the guilt, the shame, the stories, he felt something else, tenderness. A tenderness for the boy he once was. A boy who wanted to be loved but was told love must be earned. A boy who wanted to cry but was told that tears were weakness. A boy who learned that control was safer than vulnerability. Now, in the quiet, he met that boy. He didn't try to fix him. He just sat, hand over heart, and whispered, "You don't have to perform anymore." And for the first time, the ache began to ease. Meanwhile, the woman of mystery was walking her own descent. People often mistake detachment for indifference. But true detachment is forged in fire. To walk away from a connection that once mirrored your essence is not coldness. It is courage. She had felt the weight of his longing even after she left. His energy lingered, not as guilt, but as gravity. And though she tried to rise above it, the universe demanded that she turn inward too. Because every projection she received carried its reflection. She began to ask herself, why did she attract men who worshipped her mystery but feared her truth? Why did she become the mirror for their awakening, but rarely the space for their wholeness? And beneath those questions, she found her own shadow, subtle, feminine, unspoken. It was the part of her that found safety in being desired but not fully known. It was the part that equated detachment with power. It was the part that believed love would always mean loss. And as she faced it, something cracked open within her too. She wept, not for him, not for the past, but for the patterns that had bound her. She realized that even her strength had become a kind of armor. That her silence, once sacred, had sometimes been a shield. That to truly embody her feminine essence, she could not simply protect her light, she had to trust it. So she surrendered. Not to him, but to life itself. She began to soften again, not as weakness, but as wisdom. Both of them, separated by silence, connected by soul, were descending through their own darkness. And the descent, though painful, was sacred. Because the descent is where masks fall, where personas die, where the truth of who we are begins to emerge unadorned. Jung called this process individuation, the merging of conscious and unconscious, the reconciliation of opposites. For him, it was the moment the anima became integrated, when he could feel emotion without losing control. For her, it was the moment the animus softened, when she could embody strength without closing her heart. Each step downward brought them closer not to each other, but to themselves. And paradoxically, that made them more capable of true connection than ever before. He began to live differently. Conversations deepened. He stopped performing charm and began speaking honestly. He allowed himself to be seen, flaws and all. When he felt pain, he didn't run, he breathed into it. When he felt anger, he asked what wound it was guarding. And slowly, he began to embody a quiet masculinity, not the dominance of the ego, but the groundedness of the soul. He started to see the divine feminine everywhere, not just in women, but in music, in nature, in stillness. He saw how life itself was a dance between surrender and strength. And for the first time, he no longer feared softness. Meanwhile, she bloomed. Her solitude became fertile. She began creating again, painting, writing, moving her body to the rhythm of her own breath. Her energy felt lighter, her laughter freer. She stopped guarding her peace like a fortress and began radiating it like sunlight. People noticed, not because she sought attention, but because presence cannot be hidden. Her mystery was no longer an illusion, it was embodiment. The kind that doesn't demand to be understood. The kind that simply is. Months passed, then years. Their paths did not cross often, but the connection remained, not as a wound, but as a quiet gratitude. Because both understood now. The purpose of their meeting was never permanence. It was transformation. Sometimes, souls meet not to walk together, but to awaken each other. She was his mirror, he was her test. And through each other, they met the divine within themselves. He once read Jung's words again, words that finally made sense now. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. And indeed they had been. The man who once chased mystery now honored depth. The woman who once guarded her silence now spoke with grace. They had each met their shadow and survived its gaze. And from that gaze, a new kind of love was born, not for each other, but for life itself. He began mentoring others, speaking softly to those who still believed love meant control. He taught that presence is the new power, that listening is the new seduction, that a man who knows his shadow is a man who can finally love without consuming. And she began writing, her words flowing like rivers through the digital void, touching hearts that recognized themselves in her calm strength. She did not preach detachment, she embodied it. She did not speak of independence as isolation, but as rootedness. Her readers called her the woman who writes silence into light. Both had returned from the descent transformed. One evening, they met again, not by design, but by the strange magnetism of fate. It was dusk. The sky burned gold, the air humming with quiet finality. They greeted each other not with tension, but peace. The years had softened their edges, yet deepened their presence. There were no confessions, no apologies. Only eyes that had learned how to see. She smiled first, a slow, knowing curve. He smiled back, steady, unhurried. And in that exchange, they both felt it. The silent acknowledgement that love, in its highest form, was never about possession. It was about recognition. They were mirrors once. Now they were windows. Through each other, they had glimpsed the infinite. He fell for her mystery, the narrator whispers softly, but it was his own shadow calling him, to descend, to break, to remember. And she, the woman who had once been his projection, walks away once more, not in sorrow, but in sovereignty, because she knows now. The woman who walks away in silence isn't cold. She's simply become too whole to need an echo. The quiet after the storm is not silence. It is sacred. It is the moment the soul exhales after lifetimes of chasing shadows, masks, lovers, validation. It is where the war between masculine and feminine within finally ends, not in victory, but in understanding. He had learned to stand still, no longer driven by the desperate need to be admired, chosen, or needed. He began to understand that love, to be real, must be free. It cannot be born from hunger. It can only rise from wholeness. And she had learned to rest, to let go of the need to prove her worth through independence, through untouchable mystery. She began to allow softness back in, not as surrender to a man, but as surrender to life. They had both stopped running. And when the chase ends, clarity begins. In Jungian language, this is individuation, the marriage of opposites within the psyche. He had met his anima, the feminine within, and she had met her animus, the masculine within. No longer fragmented, they could finally see themselves without projection. He realized that his attraction to her mystery was never about her. It was about his own lost tenderness. Her calmness reminded him of the peace he had buried beneath ambition. Her silence mirrored the inner quiet he feared to face. And she realized that her draw toward his intensity was never about him. It was about the fire she had exiled from her own being. His focus mirrored her forgotten direction. His strength mirrored her hidden courage. They were not each other's completion. They were each other's invitation. The human psyche is not linear. It does not heal in straight lines or soft resolutions. It spirals. Over and over, it brings us back to what we thought we'd outgrown, deeper, wiser, more conscious. And so, even after awakening, they each faced moments of shadow again. Moments of longing, of doubt, of fear that perhaps nothing had changed. But this time, they didn't run. They recognized the voice of the old self and smiled gently. Because once you've met your shadow, you cannot be deceived by it again. You see it, and seeing dissolves its power. This is the quiet victory no one talks about. The peace that replaces reaction. The grace that follows understanding. The kind of strength that no longer needs to be seen. The world outside, however, noticed something. People spoke of how his presence felt different now. Women no longer saw him as charming, they saw him as safe. There was something grounding in his silence, something steady in his eyes. He no longer sought to impress. He simply was. And her? Her calm no longer came from distance, but from depth. She no longer confused detachment with power. Her voice carried both stillness and fire, a paradox that only the awakened feminine can hold. Together or apart, they had become reflections of balance, the sacred union of the inner masculine and feminine. He embodied presence. She embodied grace. And the space between them, even in separation, became holy. At times, they would meet again, at an art exhibit, a quiet cafe, a shared event. Their conversations flowed without expectation. He listened, truly listened, and she spoke without performance. The air between them no longer buzzed with tension, it hummed with truth. He once told her quietly, "You were never my lesson. You were the mirror I needed to see my soul." She smiled, not the smile of pride, but of recognition. "And you," she replied, "were the silence that taught me to listen to my own." That moment hung in the air like incense, fragrant, invisible, eternal. Because it was never about returning to what was lost. It was about honoring what was found. The feminine and masculine within every human being are not enemies. They are dancers, endlessly circling, testing, seeking harmony. But when the dance becomes war, when the feminine becomes guarded and the masculine becomes controlling, love cannot exist. True love requires integration. A woman must feel safe in her softness. A man must feel secure in his sensitivity. Only then can intimacy be born, not as dependency, but as communion. This is what Jung meant by the sacred marriage. When the conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, feminine and masculine unite within, the soul becomes whole. It is then that love stops being projection, it becomes perception. He once dreamed of a garden bathed in dusk, where a river of silver light ran between two mountains. On one side stood the man he had been, driven, restless, proud. On the other side stood the woman he had loved, calm, distant, luminous. And between them, the river shimmered. He crossed it slowly. The water was cold but cleansing. And as he reached her, he realized she was no longer outside of him. She was within. The mystery he had chased was his own soul all along. He awoke in tears, not of grief, but of release. Because the search had ended. There is a dangerous illusion in modern love. That awakening makes you untouchable, invulnerable, complete. But awakening is not the end of feeling. It is the deepening of it. The awakened man still longs, still aches, still loves, but he does not lose himself in it. The awakened woman still desires, still hopes, still feels, but she does not abandon herself for it. They love consciously now, with awareness, not attachment. They no longer need to conquer or complete each other. They meet as two whole worlds, not two broken halves. And that is what makes their connection eternal, not through possession, but through reverence. She once wrote in her journal, "He was never mine to keep. He was the reflection that taught me what I am made of, light, shadow, and silence." And he once wrote in his, though no one ever read it, "She was not a chapter. She was the language I had forgotten to speak." Those words, though separate, carried the same heartbeat, the same truth, the same quiet liberation. Because once you've met the person who mirrors your shadow, and you choose to face it, you no longer seek love for healing. You seek it for creation. The narrator's voice fades to a whisper. Some souls are not meant to stay. They come to awaken. They come to break the illusions, to pull the curtain away from the unconscious. They come to burn the false self so the real one can emerge. He fell for her mystery. But that mystery was never hers. It was the doorway to his own soul. And when she walked away, she did not disappear. She dissolved into everything. Into the scent of rain, the hush of morning light, the stillness between two breaths. Because mystery, once integrated, becomes presence. And presence never leaves. He stands now at the edge of a quiet lake, watching the sunset ripple across the surface. The sky bleeds into gold, into violet, into night. And in that reflection, he sees her face, soft, distant, eternal. Not as longing, not as loss, but as recognition. He whispers into the fading light, "Thank you for showing me who I am." And as the sun disappears beyond the horizon, a quiet voice, hers, the anima within, echoes back. "You were never lost. You were only asleep." The camera fades to black. A long silence follows. Then, the final words emerge, slow, deliberate, etched in the listener's heart. The woman who walks away in silence isn't weak, she simply sees more. And the story ends, not with closure, but with awakening.